So you want to own a tank division. You have seen the parades. You have seen the footage from Ukraine. For 80 years, the tank was the single most trusted symbol of land power a country could put on display. The machine every serious military parade built its finale around. The asset every defense budget protected first. A single FPV drone, built for around $400 in a garage workshop, flies into the engine deck of a $10 million Abrams and ends it in seconds. Open-source trackers have documented thousands of Russian tanks destroyed the same way since 2022. Here is what it actually costs to own the machine on the other side of that equation. One M1A2 SEPV3 Abrams, upgraded from an existing hull, costs $10 million to $15 million. Price it as a full export package, training, spare parts, support contracts included, and the number climbs toward $24 million per tank. Poland's 2022 order for 250 SEPV3 tanks gets quoted two different ways online, and both are real. The narrow manufacturing contract with General Dynamics was worth $1.15 billion. The full foreign military sales package, tanks, ammunition, support vehicles, training, logistics, was $4.75 billion, closer to $19 million per tank once everything is included. Whichever number shows up in a headline depends entirely on which slice of the deal that headline is describing. Neither one is what a single tank costs to build in isolation. Inside that hull, a 120mm smoothbore cannon, composite and depleted uranium armor, a fire control system that lets the gunner hit a moving target from a moving tank, and an engine that has been the tank's most famous liability since the day it entered service. The Abrams runs on a Honeywell AGT-1500 gas turbine, the same basic technology that powers a jet aircraft. It was built for speed and reliability. It was not built to be efficient. At idle, the turbine burns 10 gallons of fuel an hour. In tactical idle, that climbs to 30. Moving cross-country, it can hit 400 gallons an hour, converting to roughly 10 gallons of fuel for every single mile traveled. Do the math on that, and an Abrams gets worse mileage than almost any powered vehicle on Earth, somewhere around half a mile to the gallon. A city bus is more fuel efficient than a main battle tank. That fact has been a punchline in defense circles for 4 decades. Fuel is not the only line item. Factor in maintenance, crew, parts, and logistics support, and one estimate puts the true cost of operating an Abrams at roughly $2,500 for every mile it drives. Annual maintenance alone runs $1.2 million to $2.5 million per tank, depending on how hard it is worked. The Army's original target was 1.25 hours of maintenance for every hour of operation. Real-world testing showed the ratio running closer to 1.7 to 1, sometimes nearly 3 to 1. That means for every hour an Abrams spends rolling across a battlefield, a crew of mechanics spends 2 to 3 hours keeping it running. The tank does not maintain itself between missions. An entire logistics tail exists solely to keep one vehicle moving. The crew inside is 4 people: a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver. Training one of them to fight as a unified crew, not just to drive the vehicle but to fight it, takes months of schooling and live fire qualification before a single one of them deploys. Losing a tank rarely means losing just the machine. A crew of 4 trained soldiers sits inside it, and when a drone finds the engine deck or the turret ring, the outcome for the people inside depends entirely on where the hit lands and whether the crew has seconds to escape. Replacing a dead or wounded tank crew member is not like replacing a rifle. It means running another soldier through months of gunnery school, simulator time, and live fire qualification, while the rest of that crew either waits undermanned or gets broken up and reassigned to patch a different vehicle. An army can build a new hull faster than it can build a new veteran crew. That asymmetry, steel replaced in months, trained people replaced in a year or more, is a cost line that never shows up on the tank's price tag, and it is the one every armored force is most afraid of running out of. Now multiply by a division. The 3rd Armored Division, at its peak strength during the Gulf War, fielded 360 Abrams tanks. It carried more than 20,000 personnel across 32 battalions, alongside Bradley fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and attack helicopters. You are not buying 360 tanks. You are buying a small city's worth of mechanics, fuel trucks, ammunition handlers, medics, and cooks, all built around keeping those 360 engines turning. The United States holds roughly 4,650 Abrams tanks today across active service and long-term storage. Only about 2,640 of them are active. The rest sit in reserve, aging, waiting for a crisis large enough to justify pulling them back out. There is exactly one place in the country that can build or rebuild any of them: the Lima Army Tank Plant in Ohio, officially the Joint Systems Manufacturing Center, is the sole Abrams production facility left in the United States. The Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, which once shared that job, closed for good in 1996. Since then, every new hull, every major upgrade, every depot-level rebuild of an American main battle tank runs through one government-owned, contractor-operated building in Ohio. That plant currently turns out roughly 15 to 20 vehicles a month, with surge capacity to push past 30 if the Army adds a second shift. When Ukraine, Poland, Taiwan, and the US Army all want tanks at the same time, they are all standing in the same line at the same single factory, waiting on the same production rate. This is the same economics you have seen before in defense contracting. One government customer, one licensed factory, no real competition to bring the price down. It took the United States decades to build that industrial capacity. Losing it would take decades to rebuild. Now here is where the story stops being about one machine and becomes about the entire logic of armored warfare. Because the same era that gave the world the Abrams also gave the world a $400 quadcopter with a camera and a warhead strapped to it. An FPV drone, first-person view, the kind hobbyists once flew for racing, costs somewhere between $400 and $500 to build. Point it at a moving tank, and it can find the one place armor is thin: the engine deck, the turret ring, the top of the hull. In Ukraine, the math has been brutal. Open-source tracking has documented thousands of Russian tanks destroyed, damaged, or captured. Tens of billions of dollars in armor. A large and growing share of it ended by drones costing less than a used car. The United States sent 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, arriving in late 2023 and entering frontline combat in February 2024. Within about a year and a half, 27 of them, 87% of the fleet, had been destroyed or captured. Ukrainian forces eventually pulled the survivors off the front line entirely. Not because the tank's armor failed, not because its gun was outmatched, but because a machine designed to survive artillery and anti-tank missiles was never designed to survive a $400 drone hunting it from directly overhead. That is the sentence that is rewriting the economics of armored warfare. A weapon system costing tens of thousands of times less than its target can now reliably find and kill it. No amount of steel plating changes that ratio in the tank's favor. Military analysts have started calling this exactly what it is: a breakdown in the fundamental cost logic that armored warfare has run on since 1940. Tanks were built to survive the battlefield's most expensive threats: other tanks, anti-tank guns, mines. They were never priced against a battlefield where the cheapest weapon in the fight is also the deadliest. Ukraine's own drone production tells you how fast that shift happened. The country's factories now produce hundreds of thousands of FPV drones a month, with government targets in the millions of units per year. No tank factory on Earth, including the one in Lima, Ohio, can outproduce that kind of volume. The tank has not become useless. It has become expensive in a new way, not just to build, but to risk. Every commander sending an Abrams forward now has to weigh a $10 million asset and a 4-person crew against a threat that costs less than a laptop. The industry is not ignoring this. The U.S. Army's answer is the M1E3. Unveiled in early 2026, the biggest redesign of the Abrams platform in 40 years, not just an upgrade to the one that came before it. The M1E3 drops the crew to 3, moving them into an armored capsule in the hull and replacing the human loader with an autoloader feeding an unmanned turret. Fewer people exposed inside the vehicle, in theory, means fewer casualties when something finally does get through. It also drops the thirsty gas turbine entirely, replacing it with a hybrid electric powertrain. The Army projects will cut fuel consumption by 40 to 50%. The tank finally addressing the exact flaw that has defined it since Vietnam-era planning first put a jet engine in a tracked vehicle. Target weight sits around 60 tons, dramatically lighter than the current SEP-V3.
Most importantly, the M1E3 is being built with the Trophy Active Protection System integrated from day one, designed specifically to shoot down incoming drones and missiles before they reach the hull, rather than bolted on years later as an afterthought. The first prototype was delivered to the Army in December 2025, with more arriving through 2026, though full operational capability is not expected until the early 2030s. That gap matters. A tank designed to answer today's $400 drone threat will not reach real units for the better part of a decade, while the drones hunting the tanks already in service keep getting cheaper, smarter, and more numerous every single month of the war that inspired the redesign. That is the industry's answer to a cheap problem. Spend hundreds of millions of dollars and years of engineering to build a tank that can survive it.
It is the same pattern seen everywhere else in modern defense spending. Expensive countermeasures built to offset cheap new threats at a cost ratio that keeps getting worse for the side with more expensive equipment. Germany alone is planning to spend roughly 25 billion euros, about $29 billion, rearming its tank force, with orders for well over 100 new Leopard 2 A8s on top of the fleet it already operates, deliveries stretching out to 2028 and beyond. Norway, the Netherlands, Lithuania, Sweden, and the Czech Republic are all in the same order book, all waiting on the same handful of European production lines. That is not modernization for its own sake. Germany's total defense budget is set to climb from roughly 87 billion euros in 2025 toward 153 billion euros by 2029, and tanks are only one line item inside a continent-wide rearmament that would have been unthinkable in Europe a decade ago. None of that spending buys protection from the threat that is actually killing tanks in Ukraine.
Detecting, jamming, and destroying a $400 drone before it reaches a $10 million vehicle is now its own defense budget category, separate from the tank itself. The US Army alone is pursuing roughly $2.9 billion in new counter-drone systems, covering everything from radar detection nodes to vehicle-mounted jammers. Germany has fielded its own mobile system, a jammer mounted on the back of a pickup truck, designed to intercept small drones at ranges up to 2 kilometers for a few $1,000s per engagement. A few $1,000s per intercept sounds cheap, until you realize a single drone swarm can launch dozens of drones in one attack, each one forcing the defender to spend money to stop a machine that cost its owner less than a used laptop to build in the first place. The cost ratio never favors the side doing the defending. Look at what the rest of the world is paying for the same category of machine, and the range is enormous.
South Korea's K2 Black Panther has a base unit cost around $8.5 million, though real contracts run far higher once support packages are included. Poland's first 180 tank order in 2022 landed near $18.9 million per tank, and its second order in 2025 for the same number of tanks came in closer to $34 million each. Germany's newest Leopard 2 A8 costs $30 to $35 million per tank at the program level, nearly triple the baseline cost of an Abrams upgrade. Britain's Challenger 3, built on existing hulls rather than new production, comes in far cheaper, around $5.4 million per vehicle. Russia's T-14 Armata, its most advanced tank on paper, has a stated unit cost around $4.5 to $7 million, though production has been slow enough that only a small number have ever reached operational units, let alone the front line in Ukraine. Line all of those up, and there is no consensus price for a modern main battle tank.
What there is, increasingly, is a consensus threat. A drone that costs less than a plane ticket, that any country with a hobbyist drone industry can mass produce, that does not care whether the armor it is hunting cost $5 million or $35 million. South Korea is the one country that has turned this entire mess into a business plan. While the United States sits on a single aging factory in Ohio, and Germany waits years for its own new orders to reach the field, Hyundai Rotem has been delivering K2 tanks on schedule at a lower price to a continent suddenly desperate to rearm. Poland's K2 order alone eventually grew past 1,000 tanks in total commitments across multiple phases, making it one of the largest single tank purchases by any country since the Cold War.
South Korea did not win that contract by building a better tank than Germany or the United States. It won by being the only major producer who could actually deliver on time, in volume, while everyone else's factories were still ramping up. That is its own lesson sitting quietly next to the drone story. In a rearmament race this urgent, production capacity has become as valuable as the technology inside the vehicle. A slightly less advanced tank you can actually take delivery of beats a superior one still years from the assembly line. And the tank is not the only expensive thing that threat is rewriting. The same $400 logic is now being pointed at artillery, air defense radars, command posts, and even naval vessels. Ukraine has used cheap sea drones to damage and sink Russian warships worth hundreds of millions of dollars in the same war using the same basic economics. That is the bigger story hiding inside the tank story.
For 80 years, military power was priced in tens of millions of dollars per platform. A tank, a jet, a ship, each one expensive enough that only a handful of nations could field them in numbers that mattered. Cheap, mass-producible, remotely piloted weapons are inverting that pricing model across every domain at once. A country no longer needs a tank factory in Ohio to threaten a tank. It needs a 3D printer, a hobby drone supplier, and an internet connection to watch how Ukraine did it first. NATO planners have started calling this mass. The idea that a large number of cheap, attritable systems can offset a smaller number of exquisite, expensive ones. A doctrine the alliance spent decades moving away from and is now scrambling to relearn. China is watching the same footage and drawing its own conclusions, investing heavily in swarming drone technology alongside its own traditional armor programs, rather than choosing one over the other.
Russia's version of the same lesson has a name, the Shahed 136, an Iranian-designed loitering munition Russia now builds domestically at an estimated cost of $20,000 to $50,000 per unit, depending on the variant and how much of it is still imported. Russia has scaled production to roughly 3,000 of them a month, launching swarms of over 100 drones at Ukrainian cities on a near-daily basis by 2026. Russia's smaller Lancet loitering munition runs $40,000 to $68,000, depending on range and warhead, purpose-built to loiter over a battlefield and dive directly into whatever expensive piece of equipment it finds, including, again, tanks. None of these numbers come close to the price of the artillery, air defense missiles, or armored vehicles they are built to destroy. The artillery feeding the opposite side of this war has its own cost crisis.
A standard 155mm howitzer shell runs $3,000 to $5,000, with precision-guided Excalibur rounds running closer to $100,000 each, and the United States has struggled for years to produce more than a fraction of the roughly 1 million shells a year that planners say a serious war actually consumes. Every category of expensive equipment in this war, tanks, artillery, air defense, ships, is being consumed at a rate that peacetime defense industries were never built to sustain, by weapons on the other side that increasingly cost a rounding error by comparison. There is no insurance policy for a tank division either, the same way there is none for an aircraft carrier. When a brigade loses dozens of tanks in a single offensive, there is no spare fleet sitting in a warehouse. There is a single factory in Ohio, a handful of factories in Europe, and a waiting list that stretches years, no matter how large the check a government is willing to write. That is why every country still buying tanks in 2026 is also buying something else at the same time. Active protection, electronic warfare, counter-drone jamming, and doctrine training that assumes every vehicle on the field is being watched from above before it is ever shot at from the front. The tank alone was never really the product. The tank plus everything now required to keep it alive is. This is the real economics of owning a tank division in 2026. The sticker price of one Abrams, $10 to $24 million, depending on the package, is the smallest number in the story. The fuel alone can cost more per mile than most cars cost to buy outright. The maintenance tail behind each tank outweighs the crew that fights it. The single factory that builds and rebuilds them runs on a production rate measured in dozens per month, not hundreds. And now, on top of all of that, sits a threat that costs less than the fuel bill for one day of operations.
Every government still writing checks for new armored divisions in 2026. Washington, Berlin, Warsaw, Seoul is betting that dug-in, protected, well-supported armor still wins ground wars that drones alone cannot. Ukraine's own fighting suggests they may be right about that, even as it proves the old, unprotected version of the tank is finished. What has changed is not whether tanks matter. It is what owning a tank now actually means. Not one machine with a sticker price, but an entire ecosystem of fuel, crews, factories, and countermeasures that has to be bought and rebought every single time the threat gets a little cheaper and a little smarter. You are not just paying to put steel on a battlefield. You are paying to keep that steel relevant against a weapon that costs less than the paint job on the tank it is trying to kill. Some militaries are betting hundreds of millions of dollars that a lighter, hybrid, drone-resistant tank can restore that balance.
Whether that bet pays off will not be decided in a lab in Ohio, or in a boardroom in Berlin, or on a factory floor in South Korea. It will be decided the same way the last version of the tank's supremacy ended. The next time a $400 drone finds a $10 million tank, somewhere a camera happens to be recording, and the footage ends up online before the wreckage stops burning. Every previous era of tank warfare ended the same way, not with the tank disappearing, but with the price of keeping it relevant quietly climbing until almost nobody could afford to compete. This era looks set to end no differently.